Hi, I'm Luke George and I'm having conversations with courageous educators. Today's special guest started his teaching career in a remote town in Kimberleys and now a Director of Education working with schools to be a centre of excellence. Now, it was a confronting moment with an outspoken student that fueled his desire to create a high-performing school, and he went on to achieve 72 green NAPLAN boxes out of 80 over 8 years. And folks, if you can understand what green boxes are in NAPLAN, that is a wild achievement. And we're going to learn how he did that. So please, welcome to the podcast, David Wanstall. Hi, David Wanstall. How are you today?
Great, Luke. Thank you so much for having me on the show today.
Well, David, I've got to start. Now, it was in your early principalship at Balladura Primary that young, confronting boy, I think it was, that came to you. Could you just give us a bit of an outline of what that was like, what you did, and how that changed the way you thought about education?
Yeah, sure, Luke. Thank you so much. It was quite a while ago now, but I guess my introduction to Balladura Primary School was an interesting one because the majority of my history had actually been in country schools. And for those of us that are listening that have been involved in country education quite often, the children are well behaved. You might be working with the young staff. They're all very enthusiastic and keen to take up any initiatives you might want to implement. And upon my first day at Balladura, I was warned by the staff about going on the oval and the sorts of behaviours that the children were exhibiting, to the point where some of them actually wouldn't do duty on the oval and requested that other senior staff actually go out there. And I was a bit bemused about what that might be about, so I went out on the oval and there was a group of boys that you might refer to as a gang that were roaming around that intimidated other students in the school. And immediately engaged in a fight in front of me with another group of students that didn't really want to be involved in a fight. And then when I broke the students up, there were a number of expletives from the group of boys that I was involved with. And basically I said to them, we can't be doing this. I'm going to be contacting your parents. And one of the boys stepped forward and said, in different words to what I'm using, well, I encourage that, Mr. Wanstall, because my dad's going to come down and knock your head off. So that was virtually my first lunchtime at Balladura. And interestingly, the dad came down to the school, and he was an artistic man with his body covered in tattoos, and quite openly informed me that he sent his child to school to get an education, and that's what my job was, and don't contact him again, and wanted a full explanation as to what his child had done. And although he had probably had done it, he was very supportive of his child using physical violence. So I guess that was sort of my first day on the blocks at Balladura, and there was a great deal of, oh my God, what have I got myself into?
I can just picture what that must be, what that must look like, David, coming from that country town. We're all together. It's higher down as you walk down the street, and then you're on the oval. Just
Correct.
a bit of a conversation. Hey, boys, can you just, quietly, move aside? And then all of a sudden confronted with that sort of behaviour. But I know that we're going to be talking a lot about Balladura during our podcast, because you did take that school from that sort of behaviour to a high-performing primary school. Just before we get to that piece of story, give us some sort of context about the school that could be added to the story that you've just told us about what that looked like.
Oh, look, I think I can only go by what my perspective of the school was. I'm not sure about different staff members that were there at the time. Some of them had been there since the school had opened. My understanding would be they just thought that's the way things were at our school. A very disconnected group of students that were by and large performing academically very poorly. Their behaviour consistently demonstrated that it was the bullies in the school, particularly the boys who had difficulty reading, to be quite honest, that were quite disconnected from school. There were some good students at the school, but it was an environment for students, I think, that was not very safe and conducive to positive learning. I think there were a number of staff that were burnt out that had been there for quite some time. They were disillusioned. There had been 5 principals at the school before my arrival in a 5-year period. and for people that have been in schools such as that, it's very difficult to get continuity and improvement to occur. Our parent group were very disconnected as well, and I knew that certainly by the number of parents that were coming through the door through that first year or so that were very upset with teachers, with incidents that had happened in the playground, the way their children were treated, the unfairness of some of the behaviour management that had occurred. And really, it felt like a school that would sort of hit rock bottom after opening in 1989 as a brand new school, and had declining student numbers. So I guess that was my first feeling upon arriving at the school in those first 12 months.
Yeah. Wow, you've certainly painted a bit of a picture there, and we do know what those schools look like. But we're going to just leave that space there because we'd like to come back to that particular point in your illustrious career. So let's go right back. Now, it's interesting that you came from a background of men, I suppose, in your life as you were growing up. They were in the military. Your uncle was in the military. Your father was in the military. So you come from a bit of a lineage of military people, and yet you're a teacher. I'm interested in how did you not go down the army direction and actually moved into the education space?
Well, Luke, my grandfather actually fought in the First World War. I had two uncles in the Second World War, and my dad's a Vietnam vet. So you're quite right, very strong history to the military. And as a young child, right up until my teens, my dad was actually in the Air Force. He was a warrant officer of discipline. I guess the sense comes from my father, in a way, being a teacher, and as a warrant officer of discipline, his role really was to train pilots not in relation to flying, but in relation to being good men, and to assist them through their 4 or 5 years of the academy in order to progress into being the fighter pilots and people that we sort of see on movies like Top Gun. That was his job. My mum on the other side was a mum of 4 boys and 5 men in the household. And mum was very strong on education. Mum and dad didn't necessarily have the educational opportunities they would like to have pursued. My dad left school at 14 and my mum left at 15 and was actually encouraged to go on to year 11 and 12, very different to what we might see today, but simply didn't have the family or the monetary means in order to go on to further study and had to leave for school. So there was always a strong sense in the household to do your best at school, get a good job. And I think probably right through my childhood and teens, I was heading towards the path of teaching without necessarily being consciously aware of that. I'd been in Cubs, I'd been in Scouts, I'd moved into adventurers and then supporting and volunteering at the YMCA well before I even went into university. So although I wasn't aware, I think I was certainly on the path towards becoming a teacher.
A couple of pieces of that puzzle when you were younger, the Cubs, Scouts, adventurers, very value orientated, very culture orientated. Now, David, I'm very aware that you brought that pretty well all the way through into what you do now. You talk a lot about values, you talk a lot about culture. Do you think it came from those early years in those particular communities? And could you see at a young person of how valuable they are to set the boundaries and set the tone for any group of people, be them young people or older people?
Yeah, I think in those early days, Luke, I think it was mum valuing education and wanting us to go as far as we possibly could in our education and just her sense of value in and around that. But from my dad, it was a setting of very high standards and expectations, and we all believe our childhood is normal until we engage with others and start visiting their houses around the age of 10, 12, 13, that sort of age. And I just thought it was normal to sort of stand at the end of your bed on a Saturday morning for Dad to come and check your drawers and to make sure you've got hospital corners and that all your shoes are cleaned and lined up, and literally get a ruler to check that all the clothes hanging in your cupboard are all 1.5 centimetres in distance. That was just the life that I'd had. And I'm sort of making a little bit more of it than it was, but it was, it was a highly disciplined, highly organised, high expectations environment that I lived in the household, and certainly my dad would let me know when I wasn't meeting those expectations. And to carry on from just what I prefaced before, that it's not until you go around to one of your friends' houses and you go into his room and it's a mess, and there's books and all sorts of stuff all over the floor, and you sort of say to your friend, how do you get away with that? And he goes, well, that's how it's always been in my house, that you start to realise that you might have had something a little bit different to everybody else.
Absolutely. Right, so you started your career in the Kimberleys. Just a little bit of a description of where that was, and for those people that aren't too sure of where the Kimberleys are, a bit of a context of the school that you went to, the town, and what it was like. What was your experience like?
Well, I think the background story to that is that when I reached about the age of 12, my mum and dad ceased travelling around the country. For those that understand the military, as a family, you tend to move every year or 2 years, and that occurred till about the age of 12. And then my mum said, sort of, that's enough. My dad went to Victoria to be the warrant officer for the Australian Air Force at that point in time, and lived away from us for 3 years, while my older brothers progressed through high school, and I finished primary school and then went through my high school years. And then beyond that, lived pretty much the life that all uni students did, which was having a good time. In those days, it was a 3-year diploma for teaching. You couldn't do a 4-year bachelor directly out of university. So it was a lot of pubs, a lot of nightclubs. The band scene was fantastic in those days, and I had a great time at university. And then at the age of 20, in those times, you get a phone call to say that you're being posted to a country location, and you had to do 2 years compulsory service. And I was most fortunate enough, and I say that with tongue firmly in cheek, that my first appointment was Halls Creek District High School, which I believe you've already had a couple of people on and discussed that was their first posting. So there must be something about courageous leaders all starting in Halls Creek. But the reason I referenced all of that, it was just what a culture shock it was, just how different it was from my life in Perth and being with my friends and my family, and something that was very safe and secure, going to a location where you didn't know anybody. It was a very different culture. Most of the children at the school were from an Aboriginal background, many of them having EALD or English as a second language. And you're thrust into this environment where in the middle 80s, it was just basically you had to survive. And prior to my arrival in Halls Creek, there had been a high turnover of staff, and a number of staff literally getting off the plane at the airport, at the Halls Creek Airport, and sort of walking back onto the plane and leaving. That was a little bit of a culture that the town was renowned for. But people that have done Halls Creek would certainly be able to understand the words that I say, that it really is a baptism of fire and a growing up in sense in terms of those formative years of your teaching career.
Well, I remember my very first night there at Halls Creek, and I basically cried myself to sleep. And remember getting up the next morning and said, I really got 2 choices. I'm either going to do this or I pack it in and drive home, basically. And I'm so glad, and I think everybody would say the same, that you've got to put it in, you tough it out, and by golly, you learn a lot of your craft in places like the Halls Creek and the remotes when you do your first 2 years as a young teacher, as we did.
There were just 2 points I want to make on that. And the first one is that I think you're quite right. And if it isn't for the people that are around you, I don't think that would be possible, because mine first night, probably like all people at those times, and even possibly today, that go to Halls Creek, have exactly that experience. It probably is cry yourself to sleep on that first night. What have I got myself into? So that's the people that get you through. But in terms of learning lessons, as we look back on our career, I think the number one thing that stands out to me is resilience. And it really teaches you to be resilient and to put up with an awful lot as you make your way through that first months and years in a place like Halls Creek. So certainly that lesson has remained with me to this day.
Resilience. So you've been in the game for 38 years, the education game that is. Would there be 3 memorable moments during your educational journey to pretty well stand out some points where you could look back and just say, yeah, that was a job worth doing?
That's well, probably you have to start with where we were in Halls Creek. Nothing would have happened if I decided to walk out that second day and go, I can't do this and I'm giving it up, and we wouldn't end up where we are today. So I think Halls Creek, the work of Brian Simpson, my deputy principal there at the time, and the friends that I had that nurtured me through, and Brian really teaching me about the importance of relationships, and as a principal making sure that you're consistently talking with your staff and reaching out to them and understanding where they're at. So that's a moment that certainly stands out for me. As I progressed through my teaching career, and years in teaching primary, and then going into your first leadership role, I think that is probably an important time for me. I went to Condola Primary School and was asked to go there as the deputy principal, I think at about the age of 28, with the principal there, Lloyd Page. Lloyd, in 12 months, probably taught me more than I had learned in 5 or 6 years about being a courageous leader, Luke, and the way that he led that school and that community. I took so much from him. And then the third one probably is the whole story of Ballajura, and just that journey and how exciting that was. Yeah, that's probably the three major points. And I mentioned Ballajura because that was 15 years of my career, so it's such a big block of time. And possibly once again, like the Halls Creek, you go in and go, can I really do this? This is really difficult. I think I was just a 40-year-old man at the time. Most of the staff were much older than me, and I'm not sure that I can actually turn this school around. And then to ultimately gain the success that we did was outstanding.
I think that's a really good segue into Ballajura Primary School, and our listeners will soon learn why that was such a journey. So we started, let's go back, we'll just do a bit of a retrace. You're on the oval, bit of a confrontation with a young person. You then meet the father, who's similar to the young person in their attitude towards education. And then when you leave, you've got a school that has consistently had green boxes in the NAPLAN results, and that's 75, was that, out of 80, I think it was. And
it was actually 71, Luke, out of 80.
Thank you. 71 out of 80 over 8 years, and that's a considerable amount of work that's gone into there. So let's revisit that space. Couple of questions in there. You must have made a decision, again, a courageous decision to say to yourself that we can either stay as we always have for the last 5 years and leave the community as is, do your time, find some leafy green where you can, a little bit easier, shall we say, and we all know it's not any easier. Or you're going to have to make some courageous decisions to get teachers on board, write a vision, and understand where you need to go. What were some of those courageous decisions that you made very early on in your space at Ballajura Primary that then started to get traction to where you ended up, which we'll talk about later on? So courageous decisions at the very beginning, what did they look like?
Well, I'd love to say that I was unbelievably knowledgeable and designed all of this and knew exactly what I was doing every minute that I was there. But the truth is that first year or so, it was literally in and around survival. So I think my first reflection is I just can't stay here if things remain as they are. This is just not a long-term option. We have to do some things to change what's happening in this school, certainly for everybody, for the students, for the staff, the parents and the community, because this is a pretty toxic environment. And what am I going to do? For people that are out there in schools that are in those situations as I speak, it really is just, where do we need to start? Let's find the very first thing that we need to do. And I think for me, what I was able to grasp onto and reach back into those things that we've talked about in my past, from things that I'd been able to read. It was really in and around school culture. So we just have to try and settle the behaviour. We have to make sure that it's a safe environment for students. I had to give something to staff because I genuinely got the feeling that they had just consistently been in situations where they were also in survival and would come to school every day and go into the classroom, close their door and do the best they can without a great deal of support being provided in terms of improvement or progress. So my very first reflection would be, in those days, it was really about survival and let's just try and do something to get things moving forward.
It's a short amount of time to describe, let's do something, let's move away from survival. But I'm pretty sure we could all understand that's a literally day by day, week by week, month by month, term by term situation. And slowly but surely you started to get some wins on the board. Now, you got yourself, you and the school, and I know that you'll always talk about your people. You had some great people around you. You started to recruit great people. But there was a time when you, I suppose, hooked up with another two principals, one of which has already been on the podcast, Dr. Ray Boyd, and you became the Coalition of Schools. What was your take on that? Ray remembers it well, that it started off basically in one of the schools' office, having a morning tea. You had your deputies there. There were 6 people in the room to roundabout, and again, you made a courageous decision to say, let's do something better than what we're doing. And the three of you, with the influence of someone else that we're about to meet, actually started to put together a fantastic program called the Coalition of Schools, and that's gone on to be where the stalemate of what you're actually doing at the moment. So who were those people? What is the Coalition of Schools, and why did it make such an impact to 3 primary schools from such areas and grew so well?
Well, I'll probably have to take a step back into where we began this conversation about the school and over those first two years, Luke, in that we had some ideas about trying to improve culture at the school and worked very hard in and around setting some behavioural expectations about the way that we line up in our school, the way that parents come in and conduct themselves, starting to build a strong school uniform where there was an expectation to wear that uniform. I probably think at that time we were a fair way through that. The way that students articulate and speak to teachers and vice versa, and just starting to set some expectations about things. And I do remember working with my fantastic colleague, Jane Scorer, who went through the whole journey with me as my associate principal, and quite often we'd be sitting in my office at 5 or 6 or 7 o'clock at night having conversations about what's the next step, what do we do next. And many of those conversations are, there must be schools somewhere that are batting above their average and doing really well. Where are they, and who are they, and can we go and have a look and see what they're doing? So we're sort of on this journey. Things are starting to improve. I wouldn't say things were great. We still had poor behaviour, but we'd seen improvement. We saw some improvement in terms of the way teachers were conducting themselves. And not all of them, by the way, but some of them. And we've seen an improvement in terms of a settling of the community and of parents. And we were having these conversations, and we asked the Department of Education, can you identify some schools that are doing really well, and can we go and visit them? We actually got a list of 3 schools, and Jane and I went and visited all of those 3 schools. And the narrative from all the principals was, by and large, we're really lucky. We've got good kids, good parents, and I'm not necessarily sure why we're doing so well or why you've been referred to us, but you're more than welcome to come and have a look at our school. And those schools did tend to show those signs of things that we might have been looking for, without principals really being able to put a clear narrative around about what they were doing. And coincidentally, at about that time, a gentleman by the name of John Fleming, who I think you're going to introduce, had come across from Victoria and did a short 1 hour presentation at a Dyslexia Spelled day or event that I could not attend. And Jane Scorer, my associate, attended. Jane being a very forward, very gregarious sort of person. And John told the story of a school called Belfield Primary School in Victoria. And the story that he told was exactly the journey that we were looking to go on. But not only did John talk about this school that went on to become the highest performing school in Victoria, bar none, in a primary context, but also he was able to articulate how he went about going on that journey. I think Jane broke every speed record known to man getting back to the school, coming into my office and going, I've just sat with this gentleman and he has told this story about this very disadvantaged school in Victoria and the journey that they've been on. We need to talk to this man. Coincidentally, there were two other principals in the audience by the name of Ray Boyd and Greg Sullivan. I beat them up to speak to John, but they weren't far behind me, and they'd had a short conversation. And that really was the genesis of the coalition, and that's sort of how it began.
Yeah, as you're telling that story, David, the schools that you were looking at beforehand were doing well, or raising the bar.
Correct.
Couldn't necessarily put their finger on why. What exactly were we doing? Write down the 10 steps. So to follow that path is very difficult, whereas John Fleming had a very clear, very doable and very actionable pathway, which pretty well hit on culture, it hit on learning expectations, and it's even in the way that you presented and delivered lessons were very different, but it would get you to the end and be that high-performing school. We're just interested because we've spoken with Dr. Lillian Fawcett, who speaks about the explicit instruction, etc., and that was pretty important for you at your school, and what John Fleming would espouse as a real difference in the way that you would work with students. So a little bit of background about how you got involved, or how you got involved, and what you saw when explicit instruction was actually put in front of these particular students.
Well, before I get into explicit instruction, I think it's really important to articulate just how freeing it was to know that children from disadvantaged backgrounds could actually attain such high academic performance. And when we talked to John, just the way that you got a sense of the way that his students conducted themselves, moved around the school, their engagement with teachers, the belief that his community had in and around his school was quite freeing. I'd not seen that before. Also for me, I'd never probably experienced having all my teaching career really in lower socioeconomic schools. Mentioned Condor to you previously, Halls Creek and other environments that I had been in, Tom Price and Newman, very very working class environments. Not really having ever experienced or understood what I would call high performance is, how far children can actually go, and how limiting we are as educators towards where students can go and what they can do. And when I reference that, today I often talk to teachers and go, talk to me about what you do in year 5 as a teacher that might have been doing that grade for a number of years. And they would sort of articulate they do the same thing year in and year out. And I've changed so much, I would go, but don't you continuously lift the curriculum every year? So your year 4s are doing what your year 5s are doing down the track. And they go, oh, no. We year 5, it's the same curriculum, it's the same lessons on the same day pretty much, and I've been doing that for the last 10 years. Well, that's really demonstrating to me how much we limit the potential of students. And moreover, it might not be necessarily that teacher's fault, but we talk about connected practice across the school, and that in order to lift children's performance, we need to be doing that year in, year out in every grade, and we need to ensure that we've got a curriculum and an approach in our schooling that allows that to happen. So sometimes when people go, oh, Dave, you've got 71 out of 80 green boxes, how did that happen? That was a 15-year journey where we went from the lowest of lows, and we consistently built the kids' capacity to be able to take on more information and learn more with what we initially call core learning, to be able to do that. But I know that you've spoken to Lynn and to Louise O'Donovan, and I know that they've, certainly Louise, succinctly articulated that explicit instruction, or first engagement, should be through explicit instruction. It is absolutely the way that we move forward. And not only do I say that because I'm David Wanstall, but we know that the research clearly supports that approach. And it's beholden on all educators and certainly principals to be aware of what the research is saying is the best way that we can engage students in learning.
It's a real lift. Now, as I'm listening again, I'm putting myself in the place of a young teacher. This David Wanstall brings this explicit instruction. Jane Scorish is a whirlwind of enthusiasm. I don't know. How do we get teachers on board? Because I'd be just saying to you, David, look, it all sounds very good, but sounds like a lot of work. Sounds very difficult. Can't we just keep doing what we're doing? We're getting by. We have improved. What sort of pushback were you getting from teachers, and if any, and if there was some, how were you getting them onto the train, onto the bus, and moving them all forward? And did it take long, or was it when they just started to see a few successes? What was your sort of angle?
It's a great question, Luke, and I'll come back to the Ballajura story because that's the one I'm probably closest to, although I now work with many schools, principals, and sort of influence at a different level. But I think in those early days at Ballajura, there has to be a very clear why. And we had teachers that had possibly been 40 years into their career, had done things the way they had done throughout that period of time, and just thought that is the way things are. I get a class of students every year. I do the best that I possibly can with them. I think I've done a good job with them at the end of the year, and I pass them on. And you know what? I go on Christmas holidays and we start the same thing again next year. I can't control what happens because the kids that I get are the kids that I get. Yeah. What we now learn is that teaching is not an individual sport, it's a team sport. And as a school, you really need to build that whole consensus of we are all in this together and we all have a part to play in this journey of a child that starts with us on the first day of kindy, and where we've got schools that have got consistency in enrolment, we see that child right through the last day of year 6. What that child turns out to be in terms of their literacy and their capacity to engage in higher order thinking skills is on us. Yes, there are some factors that are outside of our control. But part of the Ballajura story as we went along was to actually demonstrate, because we weren't able to find those schools, that a school at that time probably had an ICSI of about 960, which is just under the average score for schools in Western Australia, that we could take those students and actually be very competitive against the highest ICSI schools in the state. Try to demonstrate, cliches like, postcode doesn't determine your outcomes in life. Unfortunately, if we map ICSIA probably right across Australia and the performance of schools, school performance very much matches that. So it's about saying we don't have to work within those belief systems. We can actually break out of them and achieve significantly more if we're prepared to work together to do that. So in those early days, yes, it was really about trying to convince those experienced teachers that we can do better. I really think that for me was about just trying to give them some wins, about saying that we can make your life better as a teacher. Let's try this one thing, and if it works, that's money in the bank for me. Then we'll do the second thing, and if that works, that's more money in the bank for me. And down the track, the teachers can start to make withdrawals. So it was really about consistently building those wins. Teachers could see that there was improvement. And of course, there were what we call the speedboats, and those people that come on very quickly and are keen to have a go at anything. Then we've got those cruise liners. They're the teachers that like to just sit back and say, yeah, I've seen this all before. We've had principals come in and promise us all sorts of things, and it really hasn't panned out. But I'm prepared to wait and see. And if things go well, I'll jump on board and happy to go with that. And then the third group of teachers are what might we call our submarines in our schools, and they're the ones that are determined to make sure that there is no change, that they will do everything they possibly can to keep the status quo because that works for them. So moving those teachers forward, is a real difficulty, and I have conversations to this day with teachers, with principals that have those teachers in their schools. But by showing them what life can look like in a professional sense and how much improved that can be, we try to convince that. On a young teacher side of things, I'd probably like to say that my experience in country schools and starting to employ young teachers at Ballajura, they were very keen to adopt the changes, very keen to be involved, and quite often they were the speedboats that led the way for the rest of the staff.
Yeah, look, there's a lot there. There's a lot of growth in students. You've mentioned a lot of growth in teachers. I suppose that's a beautiful thing about leadership, isn't it? It's not just about having a vision. It's about taking people on the journey and allow them to also grow and see what's within themselves. Now, you've moved on from Ballajura, and which would have been, I'd say, mixed emotions, leaving from 15 years at Ballajura as a great principal and now moving into a directorship. And that directorship you've mentioned during that last bit of conversation in regards to now actually spreading and helping more schools along that on their journey, and working in that space of the Centre for Excellence. Really, those words really drive home what we're trying to do. I'm a school centre for excellence. What's that look like, David? And how are you creating these centres for excellence, and also how are principals and schools achieving this and embracing this sort of methodology that you did at basically Ballajura?
I think, to be honest, Luke, there is starting to be clear evidence, not only in and around the teaching of reading, for example, but about school improvement that principals can identify, locate, and implement into their schools in order to demonstrate improved performance. So that's the basis of what we do. But I was very fortunate, and you're quite right, after 15 years at Ballajura, I was presented with the opportunity to apply for a position as Director of Primary Early Childhood and Education Support within the Department of Education here in Western Australia. And it was very difficult to make a decision to do that because any principal that has achieved the sorts of things that I have at Ballajura, you never feel that the journey is over. You always feel that there's more to do. The students can achieve more. We can have greater engagement from our community. But unfortunately, we had an incident at the school where my associate principal, Jane Scorer, passed away, interestingly, at school from an aneurysm. Absolutely devastated the school. Jane was the mortar that held the bricks together at the school, and it was a very difficult time for the school in and around that time. But I made a commitment to see the school through that journey and out the other side, and that was achieved. And then there was a sense of there was an opportunity and it's time to move on. So I was fortunate enough to win this position, and the role really is multifaceted. So I'll just very quickly explain to the listeners what the role actually looks like. So in terms of early childhood education, I have a fantastic team here at Statewide Services, and their role really is to engage in early childhood all the way from birth through to about 8 years of age. So the Department of Education certainly does have a role to play in programs that are before school age. And that's the early childhood component. And the other 2 or 3 components really are in and around. We have developed the phonics initiative for the Department of Education and currently support school in the implementation of that. We have an engagement team here, so we support schools that have a 1-year return in terms of their review or have requested support And that can be whole school support, or it can be an element of their school support where we have expertise in coming and can support them. And the element that you articulated is the Centre for Excellence in the Explicit Teaching of Literacy, which is a program that identifies 20 primary schools per year to come in as what we call intern schools. And they work in a wraparound program of high-performing centre schools that support them, research that is provided by inside the department and outside of the department providers, and wraparound support from the system itself. And over a 12-month intensive engagement, we try and support those schools to improve as much as we can in all of the elements that we've articulated today. We'd probably love to see that go on for longer than that period of time, but just in relation to the number of schools that wish to be in that program, and the need to meet and engage with as many schools as we can, it's a 12-month engagement. So that's by and large the work that I do.
So you've really taken all that great experience and starting to spread it out. And once again, I dare say you're having those conversations with principals about growing teachers, growing students, raising the bar, creating high expectations, understanding what a high-performing school looks like. And also, you've pretty well talked the talk and walked the walk about how you get to a point. And I think that takes a lot of credibility when you walk into the room knowing that this person's actually gone through what that principal's also has been doing. So I think that we've got a really good understanding of your background and a lot of the great things that you've done, David. So what would be three sort of tips that you could give to the listeners? What would be something easy that could be implemented into a school to be high performing, to be part of a centre of excellence, to be able to improve my teaching as a young teacher or a mature age teacher? What would be three tips off the top of your head that you'd tell anyone and say, just look at these three. These are three good ones to start off with.
Well, I can possibly look at it from a teacher perspective, but and we can come back to that, but I'd probably like to start more with whole school or principals, if that's okay, Luke. And probably the first one is to reflect on what's the potential of your school? What do you think the capacity of your school might be? Because I'm very much in and around, as Hattie says, the beliefs and values are everything, and we carry them with us, whether they're positive or negative. So my first bit of advice is go and find the very best performing school you can, wherever that is in the world. And quite a bit of the work that I did was also looking at what private schools do in relation to culture and history, and watch and observe the things that they do in that school and try and implement them into your school. So that's my first piece of advice. And if you're like me in that early part of my journey and you've never seen what a high-performing school looks like, go and find that school and have a look, and at least you will know where you can go and what the potential is. I think the second one is that everything starts with culture. And I know that when you spoke to Louise O'Donovan, she spoke quite a bit and actually referenced Drucker, and I use that same quote myself, that culture is everything, that you cannot build the best curriculum, the best assessment, coaching practices without really clearly defining understanding of what good culture is. But moreover, we just use the word culture. So once again, it's an investigation into what does culture mean to you? Right up on the board, what are those things that you value and what do they look like? And once again, how do I place them into my school? The third one, probably for whole schools and for principals, is in and around belief. And the question that I constantly ask schools is, go and ask your parents, walk out into the car park, go down to the cafe on a Saturday morning if you live in a country town or a local community, and ask parents what they think about your school. Do they think it is the best school that they could possibly send their child to? Does it have the highest expectations that they could possibly want? And do you, by and large, have people lining up outside the door wanting to come to your school? And my question is, if not, why not? And how do you create that environment? So that's what I'd say to principals and to schools. For young teachers, I would just say I guess if I take myself back to Halls Creek, that sort of everything will be okay, and that always be open to learning and to trying new things. The second one is, really go out and look at the research. So three pieces of research that I'd really like to emphasise today that all occurred very early in the 2000s and are still relevant to today is the National Inquiry into Teaching of Literacy by the great man Ken Rowe, and that was released in 2005. The USA National Reading Panel and what they produced in 2000, and the work from Sir Jim Rowe's independent review of teaching in the UK. All three of those papers found exactly the same thing about the teaching of reading. And I'm quite surprised I still bump into principals that have not read that information. So if you're a young teacher, go back to those three reports and look at those, but also look at any information that you can get or research that talks about what the high-performing schools, high-performing classrooms have. And the third one really is be a great staff member and try and garner as many people as you possibly can to go on this journey with you, because children are able to achieve so much more than you actually think they can.
There we go. No. You've got ones for the principals and 3 tips for the teachers. So now we're just going to go a little bit further out of this space. Now, I know that you have a love for old cars. I'm sure I'm allowed to call them cars, not of the modern age. So what's currently in your garage, and why do these motor vehicles create your happy space?
I don't know, Luke, I didn't expect us to go down this line in a conversation about education. But to be honest, it comes back probably to those 40 years as a kid and having everything neat and tiny, and I've always enjoyed things that are shiny. Yeah. And just as a young person, probably I can remember my very early teens going to the news agency and grabbing all the car magazines and flicking through and having a look at all these custom cars and go, one day I would love to have this. I was an avid sort of Japanese big bike, motorbike rider in my younger years, and until my brother had a tragic accident, and then I gave it away for a long time. But have come back to that in recent years, and sort of to explore those things that I've always wanted to have and possibly couldn't afford. So to answer your question, in my garage, I currently have a 2005 CV8 Monaro with 12,000 kilometres. 2006 Holden Marloo Ute with about 20,000 kilometres, which is modified, and I have a Harley Davidson which I bought from you in 2011 and have heavily customised. And I do love taking them out and taking them for a short drive, but more importantly, I love just cleaning them and looking at them. And I know that sounds a bit sad, but it's something that I love to do. So I've got a little garage at the back. So that's what's in my garage.
Yeah, look, I think it's. I always love that I love that question with my guests, because it is about our happy space, and I think we underestimate how important it is to have somewhere, something that is that creates that sense of joy, and whether it's looking at your motor vehicles, driving the motor vehicles, it's still a sense of joy, and it's about how we refill our cup. And I know just doing that is only one of the many things that you do. I know you go down the gym, you keep yourself, your mind's always active. We're sort of finishing this up, but I always like to ask these last questions. What advice would you have for your 20-year-old self, David, if you had that opportunity to have that conversation with the pearls of wisdom that you have and the many years of being in education? What do you think you might say to the young David Wanstall about to arrive in Halls Creek?
I think it's pretty much the same thing that all of us get when we get to about 60 years of age, Luke, is that it'll all be okay. But it's very easy to say at this point in time. I think as a young 20-year-old man, I was very anxious, excited, didn't know what the future might have held. And I certainly would have never have thought that landing in Halls Creek on that first day, or even going through with my cohort at university, that I would end up as a director of education and doing the work that I do today, which I am just so lucky and blessed to be able to do. So I think it would be, in the most simple terms, it'll be all right. Just enjoy the journey a little more than what you did. because at times it's a lot of hard work, a lot of late nights working on holidays to sort of get into the place that I am today. But certainly wouldn't have had any awareness of what that might work out to be.
No one's got the crystal ball, unfortunately, but it's always something nicely to look back and you most probably did do all of those great things. That we could speak for another couple of hours, David, but we might have to bring you back for some of these other insights. Look, I thank you very much, and I've always learned something new from you every time I have a conversation with you. We really appreciate your time, and continue to do those great things that you do, and continue in education. Thank you very much, David Wanstall.
Thank you, Luke. It's been a pleasure joining you today.